from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences all around the world. I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Sean Donnan in Washington on the continuing U.S.-China trade talks, David Marino on the apparent attack on an Iranian oil tanker and what it's done to the price of crude, and from London, Emma Chandra on taking those Brexit talks into what they call, I'm told, the tunnel. But first, let's start with Sean Donnan on trade. Are they negotiating right now, even as we speak, Sean?
Well, the negotiations have wrapped up this morning. Liu He, the Chinese vice premier, left the U.S. Trade Representative's office about 10 minutes or so ago. He's expected in the Oval Office to sit down with President Trump in a couple hours, just before 3 o'clock our time here in Washington, and we'll see what we get there. The big expectation today, of course, is some kind of truce will be announced, some kind of mini deal, people are calling it. We're expecting a pause possibly in tariffs that are due to go up next week on October 15th. But there's a lot more that we need to hear from both sides on the details of any truce. And we should emphasize, we are not expecting the grand bargain, if you will, today. This is not a major deal to resolve all the differences, to bring a peace to the trade wars, but something to at least put a pause on things.
And the meeting in the Oval Office itself can have some adventure. We know in the past there's been some disagreement among the president and Robert Lighthizer and Liu He about exactly what's going on. But to go to the issue of maybe the crux of it, the postponement of those tariffs. If the president decides to postpone those tariffs, October 15, December 15, does that really give us a signal that they're on the road to something bigger, or to just say it's a temporary truce?
I think it tells us it's a temporary truce. We're a long way from where we were in April or May when they were getting very close to a bigger, more comprehensive deal. There's been a lot of tariffs put in place. Then one of the things that's completely unclear right now is what would happen to a big tranche, $110 billion tranche of tariffs that took effect September 1st. So a lot of details we need to figure out here. And again, this is a partial deal at best.
Okay, and we're hoping we're going to know later this afternoon when the president meets with Liu He in the Oval Office. Thanks so much to Sean Donnan, reporting from Washington. And now we go to David Marino right here in New York about that reported attack on an Iranian oil tanker. What do we know about exactly what happened?
It's hard to tell. What the reports are that an Iranian oil tanker was hit with could be some missiles. There was some leak of oil into the water. So it's more the fear of what this could mean for geopolitical tensions that's boosting oil prices.
Well, and the fact the United States just a short time ago said they're going to send, I guess, 1,800 troops into the area to protect Saudi Arabia is not a good indication. Maybe the President of the United States think we could be headed into something bigger.
I mean, yeah, that just adds another layer of fear to the market. But the interesting thing is that even with these announcements, even with the ratcheting up of the tensions, demand is still, and concerns about demand is really weighing on prices as well.
Well, and we see that in the price, because the price spiked up right away and then it came back down. So what does that tell us about supply and demand?
Well, the International Energy Agency, again, pulled back their estimates for demand for this year and for next year. We've seen the U.S. Department of Energy do the same thing. Other analysts have done the same thing. There's real concerns that ongoing trade wars, slower economic growth globally is really going to hurt oil demand.
Okay, David Marino, thank you so much for the reporting on oil and Iran today. Now let's go over to London. Emma Chandra. Emma, I think you introduced me to the term yesterday, the tunnel. Are we going into the tunnel, and what does that mean?
Yeah, we are in the tunnel, David. Not the Channel Tunnel, but it's a negotiating tunnel. This is essentially detailed talks between both sides, between the UK and the European Union. Both teams will start looking at a draft legal text of a deal. We've not had this level of detailed talk since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister of the UK. This follows a one-on-one meeting between Boris Johnson and the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar yesterday that it seemed to be very positive. It's then had a positive reaction from the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, and that's why we're now seeing these more detailed talks due to happen over the weekend. The hope is that a deal can be thrashed out before the EU Leaders Summit, which is due to take place next week on the 17th and 18th of October. Now, we should say that we don't know that if there is a deal yet, and we don't know really what the concessions the UK government, if any, have made in order to get deal talks back on. One would expect, given the positive comments from both Ireland and from the EU, that concessions have been made. And of course, if any deal is agreed, it still has to be approved by the UK Parliament, David.
And we certainly saw a reaction, as you suggested, in the pound. It's up around 127 now. It reacted quite quickly. What's the over and under? Do we know anything from the FX traders about what happens if they do get a deal, which is not a sure thing, or if they don't?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The move in the pound has been considerable, putting in its biggest two-day gain since 2009. As you said, trading around 1.26, 1.27 at the moment. A recent Bloomberg survey had, in the case of a deal, the pound rallying to 1.33. There have been a number of calls for it to go to parity with the dollar in the case of a no-deal exit, though the Bloomberg survey put it more at 1.10. Of course, we've also seen a considerable movement in UK equities today. The FTSE 100, which usually has an inverse relationship with the pound given its export-oriented components, that still rallied some 0.8%. But the biggest move was really in the FTSE 250. That's the small to mid-cap stocks and very domestically focused here in the UK. They saw their biggest gain since May of 2010, David.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Thank you so much to Emma Chandra for the reporting from London. And now let's figure out how all of these developments around the world are affecting the markets right now. We turn to Abigail Doodle. So thus far this week, it's all been about trade. Is that still the case?
That is still the case. And at this point, with stocks right now here in the U.S. on pace for the best day in about 2 months, the best week in about 2 months, you better hope that some sort of a deal comes through. It doesn't feel like a short squeeze. It feels like there are buyers, investors, traders buying for the possibility of a deal. So from a minimum, you probably have to hope that they come through with some sort of a partial deal. That means that the U.S. will not be putting tariffs on Chinese goods next Tuesday, October 15th, and then perhaps a really good case scenario for a partial deal they'll repeal the idea that could happen on December 15th as well, along the lines of those holiday shopping period, that important fourth quarter. That would probably be a real jump for the markets as well.
So here's the unfair question, but it's the one that I was wondering: is this a trade or is this an investment? That is to say, are people saying if they get a short-term deal, it's going to help global growth, help U.S. growth, or is it saying this is where we're positioned?
That's a tremendous question, actually, because I would take the argument that it's actually both, because you have the near term in terms of the trade. So if October 15th is pulled back, that's going to be a positive for short-term markets, and then you're also we are in the fourth quarter, but going into the end of the year, which is seasonally pretty good. If the December 15th tariffs don't happen, that will also be another near-term plus. But all of this would give investors, traders hope that perhaps the U.S. and China are going to be able to ratchet out a bigger deal. Should that happen, perhaps that could help to reverse some of the slowing economic signals that we've seen more recently around trade, that uncertainty factor, and that could be a long-term positive. So if something positive happens, perhaps it could be a sign for the long term, but certainly for the near term.
So the markets, like everyone else, are watching the Oval Office this afternoon. So
whipsaw, whipsaw,
exactly
whipsaw.
Right. Okay, we'll see what happens this afternoon. In the meantime, let's go to Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, the United States is preparing to send troops to the Middle East. Defense Secretary Mark Esper is expected to announce a new deployment of forces to the region as tensions rise over Turkey's military operations in northern Syria and an attack on an Iranian oil tanker. Bloomberg has learned that as many as 1,800 military personnel are expected to be deployed to the region, including to Saudi Arabia. The move comes as President Trump defends his decision to pull back some U.S. forces in northern Syria. It's the second day of trade talks between the United States and China in Washington. Negotiators are trying to end an 18-month-long dispute that's rocked American manufacturing and hurt the global economy. President Trump tweeted that good things are happening in the meetings. The president has been delivered a legal blow in his attempt to keep his financial records private. A federal appeals court has upheld a subpoena ordering the president's accountants to provide Congress with his financial records. The ruling means Mr. Trump will lose control of his long secret tax and other business papers unless the full court reconsiders the decision or the U.S. Supreme Court blocks it. The Brexit talks have taken a step forward, with detailed negotiations set to begin for the first time since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. The pound and UK banking stocks surged. The Prime Minister has made a vital breakthrough in talks with the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar on Thursday, paving the way for detailed negotiations to start in Brussels. The two negotiating teams now have a weekend of intensive work ahead of them, examining draft long legal text as they try to work out a deal in time for the summit of EU leaders next week. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, President Trump is up against the Democratic House at just about every turn. What does it mean for his presidency and, for that matter, for the 2020 race? We talk with our political panel. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
My gut sense is Democrats are going to want to impeach, period. And I think we'll see acquittal in the Senate. And unfortunately, just the politics will overtake.
That was former Republican House Majority Leader Eric Cantor giving us the take yesterday on where the House impeachment inquiry is headed from his point of view. For their own views, we welcome now our political panel, Basil Smikle, Dr. Basil Smikle, I should say, former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, and Kelly Sadler, Communications Director for America First Policies and America First Action, which is a pro-President Trump political action committee. She comes to us today from Washington. Before we get to impeachment, which is the subject we really want to address with you, we do want to mention that Defense Secretary Mark Esper is speaking right now, as we can see, about sending 1,800 troops, U.S. troops, to help protect Saudi Arabia. And Kelly, I'll start with you. We've seen this before when you have a president under investigative impeachment who also has some geopolitical things he has to handle. How much more complicated does it get?
Well, unfortunately, this impeachment move is purely political, driven by Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, and the radical left. Now, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And obviously, the president takes his responsibilities very seriously. And, you know, this decision by the defense secretary sounds like a wise one. We're also looking to pass USMCA this year, which is a huge trade deal, which would bring more economic prosperity to this already really good-looking economy. So we're looking to implement the policies that the president was elected on for the American public, and while this impeachment charade happens on the Hill.
So, Basil, we hear from Kelly that it's purely political. Let's set aside whether that's true or not. By the way, all impeachment at some point is political. It may be gaining some traction because Fox actually has a poll right now that says over 50%, about 51% of Americans that they polled actually favor not just impeachment, but also removal from office. So it seems to be having some effect. And after all, politics does matter.
It absolutely does. And, you know, contrary to the point made earlier, Nancy Pelosi was taking a lot of flack from within her own party because the feeling was that she wasn't moving quickly enough. But at this point, as you have articulated, the American public seems to be behind it. And one of the things that's underreported in that Fox News poll is that 51% of Americans believe that this president is more corrupt than previous presidents. That is a very important point because all of the things that Democrats were saying about him, and some Republicans, quite frankly, in 2016, maybe voters weren't able to connect the dots, but now they are. So it makes it far less political and a lot more about what the American public is seeing as a president that isn't acting in their best interest.
So, Kelly, I don't want to speak for you, but I suspect you might take some issue with whether this is a more corrupt president. But be that as it may, there's an awful lot of mud being thrown around, and it's not just at the president. We have the Rudy Giuliani situation, and whether, in fact, he was associated with these two people and now have been arrested. There's accounts about intervening, perhaps the president with Rex Tillerson to help another Rudy Giuliani client. That can't be good for the president.
Well, I mean, there's a lot. It muddies the waters, and it's unneeded muddying of the waters. Let's just look at the facts. The facts are that the president had a phone call with the president of Ukraine. The White House released that transcript. The transcript of the call showed that there was no quid pro quo that was offered. The president of Ukraine said he felt absolutely no pressure whatsoever from the call, and the call was a perfectly fine call. We had the whistleblower complaint that was released to the public. We know that the whistleblower is a Democrat who has potential ties to a 2020 Democratic candidate right now. So those are the facts as we know them. All this other stuff leads into these crazy narratives, much like we saw with the Russian collusion conspiracy for the last 2.5 years.
We're speaking with Basil Smikle and Kelly Sadler. Kelly, I want to come back to you on that. You are a Republican. This is your president, and you're proud of him. Are you proud of what he did on that telephone call? And are you proud of his raising with Rex Tillerson, possibly intervening on behalf of Giuliani's clients? Are you proud of that? Would you have advised him to do that?
I I would advise the president, much like what he is doing with AG Barr, to look into the origins of the 2016 election cycle and Russian meddling and Ukrainian meddling in the 2016 cycle. This is something that AG Barr is looking into. It's something that John Durham, U.S. Special Counsel, is looking into, because there really is something, there's a there, you know, U.S. spying on his campaign, and we'd like to get to the bottom of it. And that is what the president is doing, and that's what the AG report will uncover in the coming weeks, and what Durham's investigation will uncover.
Well, in my view, if the president wants to actually look into Russian meddling, he need not look beyond his own person. He was on the phone with the Ukraine asking them to look at one of his rivals in the presidential primary. He even went so far as to have a conversation about this with folks in Australia. The issue that I have is what the president seems to be doing is creating this coterie of foreign interests to investigate people with whom he disagrees. That should scare any American. It doesn't matter what party, but it suggests that this president is willing to violate certain norms of the office, which no president, I don't care whether you disagreed with them or not, have not done and have not even come across that line. So I think this just should be concerning at the very least, and perhaps impeachable at the worst.
Kelly, you really get the last word here. What is your response? Is this helping the Republicans? Is it hurting Republicans? Is it helping the Democrats, hurting the Democrats?
Well, I mean, the Democrats have done nothing but investigation since they've been elected to office. They won the House on kitchen table issues like solving health care costs, improving our infrastructure, and they have done none of that. We have done our own polling on the issue, going into these districts where you have Democrats, vulnerable Democrats in Trump districts. And we found that impeachment is not popular at all, that they want Congress to focus on these kitchen table issues, and that they believe the president is well within his rights to ask foreign governments to look into possible election meddling in the 2016 election. Okay,
Kelly, I said you had the last word. You get it. Basil, you get the last word next time, I promise. Okay, many thanks to our political panel of Basil Smikle and Kelly Sadler. That was terrific. Still ahead, college tuition and how people pay for it is a big issue for the Democrats in the 2020 election. We talk with David Klein of Common Bond, whose mission it is to make things simpler and cheaper for students. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Figuring out what to do about the massive student debt is at the center of the platforms of several Democratic candidates for president. Common Bond is a finance company that focuses on reforming how we pay for higher education. And welcome now CEO and co-founder David Klein. David, welcome. Good to have you here. Thank you. So let's talk about what's been proposed by some of the Democratic candidates. Let's take the top ones. We have Bernie Sanders, who basically says we're going to forgive it all, we're going to go free in the future. Then you've got Elizabeth Warren with more of a means-tested, nuanced approach, and then Joe Biden, the former vice president, with yet a further step in that direction. What makes sense to you?
So if I take a step back, and for context, I'm part of the generation that has a lot of student debt. And in fact, that's why I started Common Bond. And of course, free money for all sounds great. But I think my generation isn't looking for a free ride. I think we're looking for a fair ride. And I think that's how you can categorize the proposals that you see coming out of the Democratic field. You have the proposals, the free ride proposals that say cancel debt for all, free college for all. This is where Bernie Sanders is. Then you have the fair ride, which says cancel debt for those who need it, and free college for those who need it. And actually, all other candidates in the field, from Elizabeth Warren to Joe Biden, fall into this category. What is different between those proposals is where you draw the line in terms of coverage and cost.
So when you talk about a fair ride, some of the fairness is how much you borrow, but also for what, and did you know what you were getting into? Are there some other reforms that we need beyond just paying off some debt?
Sure, we think there's a way to comprehensively solve the issue of both the college tuition crisis and the student debt crisis. We think there are a few things. One, give consumers more power with simple pieces of information that they currently don't have at their fingertips. For example, 3 things. 1, how much will it cost to go to this school? 2, if I need to take out student loans, how much am I going to pay per month upon graduation? And 3, if I go to this school and I have that major, how much will I make per month when I graduate?
Well, I want to pick up on that, but we're talking with Common Bond CEO David Klein. On that specific point, one of the things that I have read is that a fair amount of that massive student debt actually is from people who never completed the education, particularly with community colleges and things. They take on a lot of debt. And so typically you'd say, you're making an investment, it's a capital investment, you'll make a lot more money because you get this degree. A lot of the people who get this debt don't make more money.
So it is true that some of the delinquencies and defaults in this country are caused by the fact that some folks just drop out of school. I think if we take a step back and say, okay, well, what is driving or what's the root cause of the college tuition crisis in the U.S.? I think what it has a lot to do with is the fact that colleges and universities can increase the cost of tuition unabated with really no incentive to keep it in check. And so the question becomes, what can we do to align incentives between the school and the students who they ultimately make graduates? And that's the second piece of where we think there's a solution. How do we better align incentives between the school and the students to ensure that the rising cost of tuition doesn't rise anymore, or 2, the career outcomes upon graduation are strong?
Yeah, we're talking with Common Bond CEO David Klein. When we talk about higher education, we tend to think about a 4-year liberal arts education and maybe postgraduate, right? But what about things like trade schools? What about other trades that in fact could lead people to have a real living income, as it were, they could raise a family off of, that doesn't require 4 years at Brown?
We absolutely think that's part of the comprehensive solution to both the college tuition crisis and the student debt crisis, and that is more vocational training, more skills-based or competency-based training, whether it's vocational schools as traditionally we think about, or coding boot camps. There's an opportunity for us as a country to make vocational training just as worthy and dignified as we do a 4-year university.
Are the markets fixing any of this? Because we had Mitch Daniels on from from Purdue, and they haven't raised their tuition in some time. I was just out with my son who's applying at schools to Miami, Ohio, and they were proud. They said, we will not raise your tuition while you're here. Are the schools starting to get responsive?
I think Purdue is a special case, and I think Purdue is a great example of that number 2 thing I mentioned, which is figure out a way to align incentives between the school and their students. And what Mitch Daniels has done at Purdue more broadly is that they've created something called the income sharing agreement, which is simply one way for colleges to align interests with their students. And it is interesting that one of the only colleges that's aligning interests between student and school happens to be the one that hasn't raised tuition in a couple of years.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Common Bond CEO David Klein. Great to have you with us today. Up next, former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills joins us as we wait for the results of those U.S.-China trade negotiations in Washington. This is Balance of Power. We're on Bloomberg Television and we're on Bloomberg Radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. With some breaking news right now, not entirely unexpectedly. President Trump says he will nominate John Sullivan to be U.S. Ambassador to Russia. Mr. Sullivan has been the Deputy Secretary of State to Mr. Mike Pompeo. He was acting Secretary of State, actually, for a time after Rex Tillerson left. He also has served in the Department of Commerce, and before that, General Counsel to the Department of Defense. He's a lawyer who practiced with Mayor Brown and Platt down in Washington. So John Sullivan is the nomination to replace John Huntsman as the U.S. Ambassador to Russia. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, Turkey's asking for solidarity from its allies over its military offensive in northeast Syria. NATO has urged Ankara to exercise restraint in its assault, though it says Turkey has legitimate security concerns about the Syrian Kurdish fighters. NATO's also worried that Turkey's offensive could jeopardize gains made against Islamic State in Syria. Former South African President Jacob Zuma will face trial on corruption charges. He lost a court bid today to have a 1999 case against him tossed out. Zuma is accused of receiving bribes from a French arms manufacturer. He led South Africa from 2009 until 2018, when he was forced to resign by the ruling African National Congress, partly due to separate corruption allegations. Zuma has denied any wrongdoing. A powerful typhoon could drop as much as 30 inches of rain on the Tokyo area this weekend. Damaging winds are in the forecast, too. The government's warning residents to stockpile necessities and leave high-risk places before it's too late. Officials say the typhoon resembles one that hit the Tokyo region in 1958, which killed more than 1,200 people. That unprecedented blackout in California may not be coming to an end just yet after all. Hot, dry winds sweeping into Southern California are raising concerns that PG&E could widen power shutoffs to prevent its equipment from sparking wildfires. A new blaze fueled by Santa Ana winds broke out late Thursday in Los Angeles. The bankrupt utility has restored power to more than half of the 2 million customers who were affected. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Ambassador Carla Hills served in the cabinets of 2 presidents. The second time as the U.S. Trade Representative under President George Herbert Walker Bush. She went on to found Hills & Company, an international strategy and trade consultancy. And we welcome her now back to Bloomberg. She joins us today from Washington. So, Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. Can't think of a better day as they're negotiating. We're going to find out, I think, in a few hours what happened with these negotiations. Give us your perspective. It looks like maybe we may be walking away with a half a loaf rather than a full loaf. Is that smart?
Well, I think that the damage that is being done by reciprocal tariffs is enormous, and it is affecting the whole global economy. So I would rather have a mini deal than no deal, and I'd rather have a big, wonderful deal than a mini deal.
But at this point, is there any realistic prospect that we'll have a large deal, an overall deal, anytime soon?
It's a step-by-step process. I haven't been told what the contents will be, but it's generally surmised that there will be a drop-off of some of the tariffs. At least they will be stabilized, and that both sides will make some minor changes that both have asked for in terms of market access. We'll get better intellectual property protection from China, which is in their interest since they have a lot of patent holders. And so we'll see if we can create a foundation for moving forward with the second largest economy.
One of the key issues, as I understand it, you know firsthand, is a building of trust between the 2 negotiating teams. And it appears that that trust had been lost at one point, with both sides apparently sort of pointing fingers at the other side. How important is it to get that trust back? And will something even like what you call a mini deal help advance at least that part of the ball?
Trust is indispensable. It's indispensable in trade and on strategic agreements, all sorts of things. And we really need to build it up with our allies and with those with whom we deal so that they can believe that we will do what we say we will do. And so if we can move step by step, my recommendation is that we need to have regular high-level meetings and to look at what we've agreed to, how far they've come along, what we can do next, but not just stumble with problems, but have regular high-level meetings to talk about our differences and needs.
We're talking with Ambassador Carla Hills, former U.S. Trade Representative. In the meantime, though, Madam Ambassador, people have to do business without the deal, whatever the deal is. And people seem to be changing their supply lines. I mean, particularly in Europe, we can take a look over there, and increasingly people are saying, I'm not going to pass along costs to my customers. In fact, I'm going to change whom I do business with. Are we making permanent changes almost without regard to what happens down the road in a trade agreement?
Wherever there's uncertainty, you're going to have companies, people who try to get around those uncertainties. And yes, there have been relocation of our facilities in China to Vietnam, for example. But a lot of them stay there because they want to tap into the largest market, the largest consumer market, and they want to produce there for that market. So, we have to, we can't go back from globalization with digital commerce and all of that. The world is open, and we want to be a leader in that world. So it's something that we have to go to work on.
So let me make something of a turn here and talk about globalization of the NBA, because we've had this real contra-chomp arise out of the Houston Rockets general manager with that tweet that's really gotten crosswise of the government in China. But might it actually affect the trade relationship in a sense? Because the NBA is something that all Americans can understand. Free speech is something all Americans can understand. From the Chinese side, as I understand, they take great umbrage. They take great offense. Could this actually infect the trade negotiations?
Well, I do think you make a point that the popularity of America worldwide has declined in the last couple of years. And so you're a consumer, you go into a store, you're looking at something made by the French or the United States, and you may choose the French because you don't want to do business with us. So I think that trust, building up confidence, and being a leader. You know, for 70 years, we have been a leader in the various things that we've created, from Bretton Woods to the World Trade Organization to NATO and so forth, that has led to prosperity and stability around the world.
How quickly can that leadership position be restored if, in fact, it has been eroded? Can it be turned around?
Of course it can be, with good leadership. I think there's a fence globally that we have pulled out of a lot of worldwide agreements, some of which we initiated, and that range from trade, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to climate, to the nuclear arrangement with the Soviets, the nuclear arrangement with Iran, and so forth. And so we need to bolster up our trust that others say, if you say you're going to do something, we know you're going to do it.
Many thanks to Ambassador Carla Hills. And I'm delighted to say she's going to be staying with us for the second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio starting at 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. In the meantime, coming up here, he is perhaps the best-known whistleblower in history. We talk with Daniel Ellsberg of Pentagon Papers fame to get his views on the current whistleblower, or whistleblowers, who made public President Trump's communications with President Zelensky of Ukraine, and where that all could lead us. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Before there was a Zelensky phone call, before there was WikiLeaks, there was perhaps the most significant leak in U.S. history when Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst at the Rand Corporation, leaked the Pentagon Papers. It was 3,000 pages of analysis and 7,000 pages of documents. He leaked them to the New York Times and then the Washington Post, and it precipitated a national crisis as people read from the government's own documents that the Johnson administration had misled the American people about the origins of the war in Vietnam. Welcome now, Mr. Ellsberg himself, joining us today from Oakland, California. So great to have you with you, Mr. Ellsberg. So explain to us, going back on that, you have such a point of view on the role, the proper role of a whistleblower, so-called, in a democracy such as ours. What is that role?
To tell the truth to the American people that they need to know to be the sovereign public, to allow the Congress to act in an informed way on the issue of war and peace, over which the Constitution gives them exclusive power to decide whether we go to war, Article 2, Section 8. That's eroded a great deal in recent years, in fact, in my lifetime. But it's extremely important to get back to it if possible. Or if you find the Constitution being violated clearly, every official, every military officer, as I was in the Marine Corps, every civilian official, every member of Congress takes the same oath of office. And that oath is not to the president. It's not loyalty to a Führer or a president. It's not to secret keeping. That oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, when an official hears his boss, or the president in particular, misleading the public and Congress and getting them into especially a hopeless or illegal war, but any kind of war, misleading them and lying them into war, as I heard my President Lyndon Johnson, doing in August of 1964, what should they do? That's not an easy one to answer, actually. what I did was not the best response. It was like all the other thousands who knew that we were going to war when the president said we weren't. And that was to keep my mouth shut and loyally obey the president, however wrongful or misleading his policy. That was wrong, and that's what all the dozen people who heard the president, this president, Trump, commit a crime on the phone with more than a dozen people listening in. Not one of them, so far as we know yet, informed an outside authority, I mean outside the White House authority, like the Justice Department even, let alone Congress, about that, and that was wrong.
We're talking with Daniel Ellsberg, the former RAND researcher and the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. So you said something very important right at the beginning of that answer, which is what the people need to know. And one question is, who gets to decide what the people need to know? Back when you were operating, you went through the New York Times. You had editors of the New York Times that took a look at this and said, yes, the people need to know this. Ultimately, the Supreme Court sided with them. Now we have the ability to go to the globe instantaneously online. Is there a much greater danger that, in fact, there's no check or balance on a whistleblower?
Well, this particular whistleblower, he or she, we don't know yet, did follow the rules that have been provided in recent years for getting information to Congress that he or she feels they really need to know and is being withheld from them. And that's to go to the Inspector General, in this case of the intelligence community, or in other cases an agency like the CIA, which was brought in on this, it seems like, or the Defense Department. Those rules didn't exist for protecting a whistleblower in my day. But even now, and I'm glad that they use them, it should protect this whistleblower from prosecution. But it doesn't protect their career, and it doesn't even protect them physically. In theory, their anonymity is supposed to be protected. In practice, when people go through channels to tell on their boss within the system or their agency, that information gets back to their boss, and they do suffer in their career. They're fired or denied access, retaliated in various ways. Second, since the wrongdoing that's being revealed is within the executive branch and may even involve the president, as in this case, it really doesn't get passed out to Congress. It's not to their interest. So the whistleblower fails. In most cases, I would say that despite this success, a whistleblower with this kind of information would be better, would do better to get the information out and even to be anonymous, to go to Congress directly and to the media. They will be known, their identity will be known to the people they work with, but there will be some effort to keep them anonymous, and that will be more reliable than going through the government channels.
Right. Once again, we're speaking with Daniel Ellsberg, former RAND researcher and leaker of the Pentagon Papers. But there is some legitimate interest, isn't there, Mr. Ellsberg, in some sort of privacy or secrecy in the government? We need to be able to keep something confidential. And in this instance, as you say, the whistleblower went through the right channels. Ultimately, that was stymied by the Office of Legal Counsel, we're told, who said there's an executive privilege, so you should not be disclosing it. What is the balance there between, on the one hand, the president being able to have frank discussions without thinking they're going to be plastered all over the newspaper and on the internet, on the one hand, and the other hand, are finding out wrongdoing?
Of course, there is substance in what you're saying about the need for some privacy and certainly from some secrets from foreign enemies. There's really very little justification for secrets from the right committees in Congress or in closed sessions of Congress, and that's invoked all the time. The president does not have the privilege, executive privilege, of keeping secret conspiracy on a crime, discussions of unconstitutional or criminal activity. It's like the mafia needs secrecy, but they're really not entitled to it since nearly everything they do is illegal. That's not true, of course, for the executive branch. But it does mean that when they do plan something illegal, as in this case, the use of foreign funds in order to improve their chances, Trump's chances of an election by defaming his main opponent. In that case, you can be sure the secrecy system will be used. And in theory, it's not to be used for that purpose. In practice, that's the main reason for keeping most secrets beyond 2 or 3 years. The overwhelming majority of classified documents are from 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 years old. There's no national security involved in keeping that secret. You never know what may be embarrassing in the future, what promises will not be kept, what predictions will prove to be false, what will appear to be criminal or wrongful, disastrous. So you keep it all secret. And that's really the main purpose of the secrecy system. It's not an abuse. Of course, it has the purpose to keep legitimate secrets legitimately from enemies or foreign rivals. But that is a minor percentage of what is actually kept secret. So we're seeing two flaws, I'd say, in our secrecy system in this very instance. One is the familiar, regular abuse of classification to hide criminal behavior. The other is there is currently no way for a whistleblower to reveal crimes that are classified without risking prosecution. That requires legislation to change it. It's up to Congress to change that.
Okay, Mr. Ellsberg, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. That is Daniel Ellsberg. He's former RAND researcher and the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, coming to us from Oakland, California. Now it's time for the stock of the hour. We're taking a look at Apple, which has hit a record high today on optimism about the iPhone demand and U.S.-China trade talks. Kayla Lentz is here with more. Yesterday I joked it's Apple 11, the iPhone 11 to the rescue.
No, it really is. It's so interesting. Where we are right now is so different from where we were for Apple at the beginning of this year. Remember, start of 2019, it's cut its revenue outlook for the first time in about 2 decades on weaker iPhone demand. And really what has led to the most recent rally is optimism that the iPhone 11 specifically demand is looking pretty good. You have this stock that's now added more than $500 billion to its market cap this year. It's catching up to Microsoft, may once again claim that most valuable company title. And it's really all about the iPhone 11. You had reports last week that Apple was actually looking to increase production by about 10% because demand for this phone has been so strong. You've seen a slew of analysts either upgrade or raise their price targets this week, saying that the demand picture looks pretty good. And of course, as we know, China is a huge part of this. They sell millions of iPhones in China. It makes up about 20% of the company's revenue. So not only are sales looking strong on the iPhone, but just more broadly, when we think about what is going on in Washington this week, trade talks between the U.S. and China, optimism that maybe those talks are going well, that could lend itself to a better demand picture in China. So that's likely aiding the stock.
So you get the iPhone 11, but overall the market's up on trade.
Yeah, Apple certainly is part of this broader rally. We are pretty well off the highs, I should say. Nonetheless, we're still up, the better part of 1.5% on all three of the major averages. There's a lot of optimism about these talks. The president says they're going pretty well. Of course, what brought equities off the highs, some other geopolitical risks like deploying troops to Saudi Arabia, some stuff going on in the Middle East. But nonetheless, investors seem to be pretty convinced that things are looking good down there in D.C.
Yeah, and on trade, we may know within the next couple of hours, and the president has that meeting in the Oval Office. Many thanks to Bloomberg's Kayla Lentz. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're getting the locations now for the 2020 presidential debates. The first one will be September 29 in Notre Dame and South Bend, Indiana. The second one will be, this is editorial content, October 15 at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Go Blue. And the third will be October 22nd at Belmont University in Nashville. The vice presidential debate is October 7 in Salt Lake City. In the meantime, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit today gave President Trump a potentially significant setback in his growing battle with Congress, ruling 2-1 that the president's accountants must turn over his financial records to a House committee investigating possible conflicts of interest or violations of the Constitution's Emoluments Clause. Welcome now Greg Farrell, who covers financial investigations for Bloomberg. So welcome, Greg. Now, it is the Court of Appeals. They can go en banc, which is the entire court. They can go to the Supreme Court. But how significant potentially is this?
I think it's significant, particularly after the ruling this past week in New York along a similar line for a different set of reasons. The president's 0 for 2 in the past 7 days with trying to convince a federal judge that basically that these people have, the prosecutors and investigators in Congress have no business looking into his tax returns.
And as I understand it, that was a lot of the debate at the Court of Appeals was, is there a legitimate legislative oversight capacity pursuant to which this is being done?
Yes. So that was a key element, was Trump's lawyers, the president's lawyers, contending that this is not within the normal purview. It's, I'm paraphrasing, to some extent a fishing expedition, or it's more appropriate for law enforcement if they're looking for problems in tax returns, and that is not something the legislature should be doing. But the prevailing argument was no. There's a set up by Congressman Cummings, who said this is part of our legitimate oversight function. We noticed there was the discrepancy with how the Trump organization accounted for Michael Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. It goes back to that again. And this showed that there was a hole in the way these things are reported. And going forward, it's our business to know if we should change the law regarding presidential disclosures.
So it's important to try to keep these things separate because there's a growing number of them. As you said, there was an earlier ruling that basically it stayed essentially a district court decision. That had to do with the tax accountants and the tax returns for President Trump, and that is a criminal proceeding, investigation by Cyrus Vance here, a local thing. So this is entirely different. This is the Congress saying we need it. The other one is Cy Vance, the local prosecutor here saying I need it for a different reason.
Yes, but there's a similar defense in both cases. In the Manhattan DA's investigation, Cy Vance, the president's lawyers argued that he has no business rummaging around this. It's like it'll be a distraction to the president, and it's a fishing expedition. And the federal judge, basically swept that aside a few days ago and said, no, it's a legitimate function here. Now, yes, it's going to be appealed, so that's going to slow things down. That's part of the president's defense strategy, and it's a successful one, is to appeal. And I think, as you pointed out a moment ago, that's what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. with this as well.
Yeah, none of us want a constitutional crisis. At the same time, if there's a conflict between the executive branch and the judiciary, it may come up here before it actually gets to Congress going after things on the impeachment inquiry.
Yes.
In a slower track.
Right. A constitutional fight between the legislative branch and the executive branch. This could eventually go to the judicial branch and all the way to the Supreme Court.
And then the question is, does the executive branch follow the orders of the judicial branch?
Yes, absolutely.
That's when it gets tricky. Okay, many thanks to Greg Farrell of Bloomberg News. Coming up on Balance of Power, and we're going to continue over on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to have more with Carla Hills, the former U.S. Trade Representative. We'll also talk to Riva Gujan about what's going on with that Iranian tanker. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.